Well, good afternoon and welcome to this brief video about a book just out by Jan Holton called Longing for Home. Actually, we've got a 2016 publication date on this. So, Longing for Home, Forced Displacement and Postures of Hospitality out of Yale University Press. I don't want to mangle too much of an introduction, but Jan Holton is now a professor at Duke Divinity School. So here's the steps in Longing for Home, and I hope you can read this. These are the chapters. Notions of home, leaning into God, crisis and forced displacement, breathing home, conflict and death, war and home, chronic displacement, and persons without home, and then postures of hospitality. So these are going to be the steps that we go through in our discussion today, which is kind of strangely pertinent in several ways. One is that we're in a situation where many people are kind of figuring out what home means to them, those who are able to live in a home and are having a lot of time at home. So reading this book in light of COVID also made me think, I wonder what the author would think about home in this context. Another reason why this is important is that people are facing higher rates of eviction now and a risk at being evicted from their homes as a result of unemployment and situations of being kicked out of their rental properties. So home is almost a vexed issue at this point, which I think makes this work important in fresh ways. Quick disclaimer, I'm co-editor with Jan Holton of the Journal of Pastoral Theology's book reviews section. So there's a dual relationship there. And so let me just go through a little bit of the structure of the book with you and talk about what I think some of the important key ideas are. And then again, I'll say what some of the connections are that I found meaningful and moving about this book at the end of our discussion. And this should take about 15 minutes, I think. So Holton talks about, and I should mention this builds on previous work she's done with the Lost Boys of Sudan, refugee displacement. And so her work in this book kind of comes out of different contexts where she's worked with displaced peoples, refugees, and then she makes some connections as she explains the home idea to other contexts as well. So Holton says that forced displacement has happened to 200 million people around the world. And she talks about how disruptions of place then lead quickly to disruptions of social ties. So this is one of her most important ideas. She's saying how places link us socially. We're connected through place. So when we have our place disrupted, we have our social ties disrupted then. And she talks about, and so you could see this just easily when it comes to a disaster. So if you evacuate for disaster and then you have everyone back home quickly, and you basically return people to their same community, then you have less of a chance of disrupting the social ties. But if disruptions of place are long-term, permanent, if there's forced eviction, if people are changing homes, they might experience more devastating fractures in their social ties. She talks a little bit about Jesus as a displaced person in this book, as a claim for that undergirds her work and gives inspiration to her work. And also gives a reason why communities of faith are necessary as a central place of responding. So this is a book about pastoral care where the community of faith is close in the background when it comes to our responses. She talks a little bit about the differences between forced and voluntary displacement and terms like economic refugees. And so she does some definitional work in terms of immigration, emigration with the E, and refugee status, talking about forced displacement, But she also makes the important point, I think, that leaving home, even if it's chosen, is not necessarily also creates a kind of displacement in the self. So she's going to really do a nice job, I think, of explaining the importance of home. So that was the introduction, and now we're going to go into notions of home, this first chapter. She talks about how, colloquially in our religious language, we have this notion of a heavenly home as a place where we're formed in the most kind of intimate ways. And she shares a moving story about her own experience with her mother, talking about her heavenly home. So experience of a home is one of an intimate set of three different things. One is family, whether biological or chosen. The second is physical environment, both natural and built. And then also, number three, close after, is God or the sacred. So those three things, family, biological or chosen, physical environment, both natural and built, and then God or the sacred come together in our experience of home. So she's doing a really nice job showing how home is close to our deepest religious convictions and deepest held religious convictions. It's also the place where we're shaped. And as well, it's also a natural environment. So it's all of those things. She talks in this chapter, the chapter 1, Notions of Home, about Claire Cooper Marcus's idea of house as a mirror of self. She says a person-place relationship is very important. And so people must have an environmental context. So this was, I thought, such an interesting and important idea because I think all too often in pastoral care, we think about isolated individuals having conversations, and we don't think about that central role that the place might play in someone's life. Place is also something people create through talk. So it's someone might say that you create the place through the discourse that you say about it. So the language you use about a place, whether it's positive or negative, then goes on to shape your perceptions of that place, even shaping your memories of that place. And so you might think about people who have to move rapidly and then they lose a chance to kind of narrate the place where they used to live before as kind of experiencing a double loss, both a loss of place and a loss of place in story. So she talks about how refugees, and this is again her area of expertise, refugee communities often have meta-narratives about the conflicts that led to their displacement. So that's a way in which the language about the place that they left and the language that they're using to describe their place, the leaving itself, kind of come together to create a discourse about place, a discourse about refugee-ness that then impact how they are experience conflict and all the steps of displacement. So, and after all the people in a community leave, then the place continues to exist in memory. So it'll be memory-based. So if you think about how often people are leaving rural communities now to move in to cities, and that's almost a life cycle event in a lot of rural communities, they experience a kind of, they have to keep the place alive through memory because everyone is gone, in a sense, from the previous generation. So here's an important quote I found from Holton's work. Quote, "A deep sense of longing often accompanies thoughts of the home place when one is absent. Home is compromised, or one has never been able to successfully identify with a home place." So and that's from page 25. So when a sense of home has been there, but it's been compromised, or one has never been able to experience a connection to home, Holton says that kind of creates a longing for place in an individual, specifically a longing for a home place. And you could see this in Linda Burton's therapeutic work with African American families as she talks about this notion of the home place and how white therapists and social workers would sometimes make microaggressions if they didn't understand the central role that the home place played as a source of identity and kind of shoring up the self for African Americans. And that home place was something different than and more than one's neighborhood. So if we don't have a connection to home place, or if it's disrupted, Holton says that we're going to experience a kind of longing. She says that different specific traditions care for home place in different settings. But having a home is one way of saying just kind of directly what's mine and what's yours. So it's a fundamental thing in a lot of settings. It might even be described as a fundamental psychological need, unless you're interested in communitarian living. But home is a kind of way that creates a boundary that says what's mine and what's yours. And fundamentally, homes are relational settings, Holton argues. Let's look now at, so that was chapter 1, notions of home, and it's a very deep dive into the literature of place attachment in relationship to home. And she does a close look at some of the most important figures in place attachment, including Yi Fu Tuan, who coined the term topophilia or love of place. So that's her first chapter. Number 2 is, chapter 2 is her leaning into God, her theological chapter. And she talks about how, relational themes related to home displacement and return. And she describes them in a theological point of view, especially kind of an existential or hermeneutical point of view. She says that according to Tillich, we use place to avoid the anxiety of finitude. So there's a sense in which place isn't just neutral theologically, but it also can be used kind of theologically and emotionally. So maybe we pour ourselves into a sense of place or preserving our place because of a fear related to other things or fear related to mortality. And that, if we avoid dealing with that fear theologically, Tillich says, we might choose some kind of lesser good to pour ourselves into, namely place in this sense. So we can use our place or try to establish our place to avoid the anxiety of finitude. But what goes on when we talk about home? There's at least 4 different things that Holton talks about. Number 1, she says, home frames our shared ways of making meaning. Number 2, home creates in us a sense of belonging. Number 3, home names the places that are safe. And number 4, home teaches us to create relationships. So home is kind of, it's more positive, I think, ultimately for Holton than her Tillich quote suggests. But home is a place where people in relationship create a sense of belonging, create a sense of safety, and have a space to create relationships that then are going to be fruitful in ways that contribute to home life. And she makes the ultimate point that home is a place where we learn to lean into God, to whom we ultimately belong. So our lesser attachments, places like home, then become places where we can learn to rely upon God as a greater attachment in cases in which home disruption occur. And she talks about the powerful example of Marika making a home for Congolese women who had been raped and had abusive places of residence. And so she said that this setting where Congolese women who'd been raped in war conflict were brought into a home just shows the dignity and power theologically and psychologically of home and the significance of it when we lose it, and how kind of being put in a safe place can be such a powerful thing that can help you feel held together, which is what Marika's work was doing for these Congolese women. Okay, number 3, crisis and forced displacement. So she talks about how people in our context, refugees, are often forced to leave home. in the immediate danger of annihilation. And she makes the important point that this often includes leaving behind worship spaces that have been sacred. So in losing home, refugees communities also lose worship space or sacred spaces where they encountered God. She talks about the short-term and longer-term stabilization journeys and the restoration and resettlement in another country. And again, they found what's so important in this journey is some kind of continuity. So in what sense does someone have continuity with people that were a part of their community in the past? Or is that crisis of enforced displacement also kind of being forced into an entirely new community? And so she talks about the challenges and the power of that moment of crisis and forced displacement. And so there's more that could be said about kind of the role of social services and support in disaster recovery, and how if there isn't the right kind of support, then often there's a sense of disillusionment in that aspect of forced displacement. But let's talk now about chapter 4, which is called Breathing Home, and it's also where Holton becomes her most poetic, I think, or almost rhapsodic at points. She talks about the Batwa people who were displaced from the forest, and she describes the apostle Miriam, who becomes the guide for her interpretation of this community. And in this community, she really does more in this chapter with the environment than she does elsewhere in the book. And she talks about the forest as home. And she talks about how the Batwa, who she was introduced to by Willie James Jennings, incidentally, the Batwa were displaced from their home because the forest became a World Heritage Site. And so even the act of protecting the forest, in a sense, as important as that was, led to the displacement of these people. She talks about the kind of knowledge that the Batwa have of place as they walk through the forest, and how they're really breathing home as they let in the air and they breathe in with the trees. And she talks about the kind of knowing that happens as they walk along the trail. The forest as psychologically healing, and also the ways that they navigate the forest, showing a kind of a relationship between the forest and the people as a group. So they had, and there's some discussion of nature as a healing place, as a home in a sense, and how some of the legacies of colonialism meant that the Batwa had no land rights, while other groups in the area were closer identified with the whites, and so they were given kind of property, and so they had a place to stay. But the Batwa remained in the forest. And she, one of the most interesting parts of this chapter is when she sees, when they leave at the end, and she sees the Batwa performers without their masks or removing their masks. And I almost had a feeling like she had a sense of a kind of performative quality to the encounter too, so that she was able to both be engaged and learn about this group, but she also saw, in a sense, that there was a performance happening, or she saw, after the masks were removed, what the performance might have meant. Okay, so chapter 5, Fleeing Conflict and Death. Here, Holton is talking, as a pastoral care text, she's talking deeply now about some of the conflicts that happen in relationship to home. So she talks about how many people who are removed from their home will have experienced some kind of symbolic rejection first. In traditional cultures, they might be seen as a victim of cursing or of witchcraft. And in this sense, being exiled is also a form of being kicked out of home, but it's also another way of talking about the disruption of those social bonds that have connected people to one another. She does this nice job of describing home place as both an anchor and a compass, something that roots you, but also something that gives you a direction forward. and how many refugees then fleeing conflict and disaster have two home places. They have the home that they've left, and they also have the new place. And so what happens when they're able to use an I in both contexts? What happens when they're able to use that personal pronoun I in both the setting that they left and the setting that they have been sent into? She describes Dang, a South Sudanese refugee in a camp in the Kenyan desert, who longs for the cool water of the Nile. So Dang keeps in mind the imaginary community that still exists in his mind of the past, where he came from, the Nile River, even as he lives in the Kenyan, in a South Sudanese refugee camp in the Kenyan desert. Crossing the wilderness, she says, puts refugees into a decades-long struggle to belong. They can feel like outsiders before they know why or how it became this way. They can lose citizenship status and become kind of in-between people, stateless people, like the South Sudanese denial of citizenship rights. And so then they can be in between, and like the U.S. and Australian government's response to these stateless people to lock them up is a kind of sign of a fear of the stranger, a fear of the traveler, and a management of unease. So one of the consequences of that hatred of a foreigner is then that people hate foreigners in order to gain back power lost in other places. And Holton says that the nation then becomes a symbolic body to be protected. She shares a wonderful story about how traditions carry over in a Sudanese community that relocated in the United States. In Sudan, they had been under a tree to make all of their community decisions. And then in the United States, in a parking lot in their development, their housing development, they all gathered under the tree, but all these African men were gathered under the tree, but the police experienced it as a threat or thought this was a threatening group. But indeed, what was happening was that they were creating the same rituals of gathering under a tree to make community decisions in a new setting. But in this case, it was a U.S. parking lot in an apartment building complex, which is never used in our setting for gathering places. So there was a kind of mixed communication that happened here. So fleeing conflict and disaster, Holton says, is a long-term process that begins often before the conflict itself, and then it has long-term psychological consequences as well. In her chapter 6, she talks about war and home. She describes how people returning from conflict as warriors, as soldiers, as chaplains, they experience sometimes they experience a moral injury from committing crimes, and also from being displaced from their own community. So they come back as foreigners. And she describes this as kind of an ontological insecurity. So she admits that veterans don't necessarily fit into this context of people who are losing their homes, but they are people for whom home place can be a vexed reality. She says people who come back from war are struggling with some of their core assumptions being violated, that the world is benevolent, that the world is meaningful, that the self is worthy, and they're having to wrestle with a world in which they may no longer perceive God as in control and evil as random. And then they might experience some symptoms of PTSD, which is the body system's attempts to integrate. And she does a nice job of describing the warrior bond between people who have been serving together. They might be lamenting the loss of that distinctive warrior bond. And she talks about treatment approaches and drawn from trauma therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy. But she also says that the church community has a central role to play here in not ignoring the despair of those who are coming back from war, especially as they've experienced a sense of deep insecurity, and a lack of stability in their new place. She uses some powerful quotes from veterans in this chapter to really describe their outsider status that comes from being crafted into a moral community that's conditioned to kill, and then returning to a place where that is no longer their purpose, and how that creates a deep tension in the self. And she talks about Winnicott's holding space as a way to respond to this. Number 7 is chronic displacement and persons without home. She draws from her experience working in a homeless shelter for women, a place where many people had addictions and mental illness. And she talks about how 200 million people are homeless globally, and 3.5 million are homeless in the United States alone. Addiction, mental illness, and incarceration are intertwined in their experience of homelessness. And part of it, too, is the housing situation in the United States. If this is something you're interested in, I highly recommend Matthew Desmond's book, Evicted, for a close look at one community's struggle with this. But she says that we have a low level of single-room occupancy housing in the United States. And so people might be moving out of low-income projects into areas where they don't have a lot of single-room occupancy. So people who might be what Edward Wimberly calls relational refugees anyway, may be looking for a single place to stay. But because of the dominance of single home dwellings and then apartment dwellings, there's not this low income single room occupancy homes anymore in the United States, or few of them. So she talks about economic refugees in the United States, and given what's going on right now with the COVID lockdown and the economic crisis, the depression we're entering, this seems like an especially important chapter. She talks about how a lack of face-to-face interactions with the homeless leads to their objectification. And she tells some powerful stories about intervening with people with mental illness histories in order to try to keep them housed. And she talks about the challenges of these caring for these populations that are vulnerable, but not just because of things happening inside of them, but also because of the societal structures they're facing. Okay, so now she's going to turn to her solution, which is number 8, postures of hospitality. Here again, the central notion of Holton's book is that home and relational bonds are deeply connected. So disruptions of place lead to disruptions of social ties. And so then restoring a sense of home has to include a kind of repairing of woundedness that comes when people are displaced from the bonds of home. From her experience with working with refugees, she finds they're often asking questions like, don't people know that we're suffering? And will they remember us? So she talks about how hospitality is kind of a central Christian practice. And she quotes Barbara McClure's notion of the kingdom of God here, and hospitality as this small but meaningful sign of God's kingdom breaking in. But hospitality is complicated, of course. It requires negotiating boundaries. Who will I welcome in? If we pretended that our homes were places of total openness, it would deny the safety and significance of the welcome. I think that's a very powerful point she makes on page 173. So if you're in a situation or a family that has a continually open home, it almost makes it the case that it doesn't have a home or it doesn't have a safe home place, unless that place is a significant place of shelter or safety. She says that Jesus' mere presence invites people into deeper postures of faith around sacred hospitality. So she talks about 4 different ways that people in communities of faith can be hospitable. 1 is sacred placemaking. 2 is honoring a new sense of we. 3 is willing vulnerability. And 4 is love and justice. So there's hospitality that Holton describes as not cheap, but it's going to involve changing your story in some way because of the ways that you're encountering the new story of someone else. She talks about being at a refugee center and noticing the structures of the ropes that guided people through the refugee center so that they could get food. And she noticed that the structures of the ropes kept people in line, and it kept people moving through the space. But it also kind of monitored and controlled their bodies and policed their bodies in some ways. But in some ways, that structure of the rope in the refugee center at the food distribution point becomes a metaphor for home itself, or for how when we seek to create the conditions of home, we have to create a structure for them as well, or else kind of hospitality becomes meaningless in a deeper sense. So I was profoundly grateful for Holton's book. It made me feel strangely nostalgic and homesick at the same time. I thought about people like myself as a third culture kid who has kind of identified with more than one place. And I also thought about the ongoing refugee crisis and the tent cities on the U.S.-Mexico border, and also kind of people's precarity around housing right now, and how the fact that so many people are at risk of losing their housing. Holton's book helps us understand what that means at a deeper level. It's not simply that they're at risk of losing a physical place. They're also at risk of losing bonds to community, bonds of relationship that are shaped in place. And I find this book to be a really helpful look at what's at stake psychologically in our tendency to make a home, to want to establish a home, to create a home. And then what does it mean to be hospitable, especially in a season where so many face risks at home, or they face the challenges of creating a new home place after being displaced. So I'm grateful for this deep and insightful work, and I hope that you have a chance to take a look at it. Thank you.